You stand in the glow of 1,000 trembling candles. The air is heavy with the perfume of frankincense and fear. Silk banners droop in the cathedral's stillness, their golden threads glinting against the damp stone walls. You can hear it, the muffled shuffle of priests, the low murmur of Latin prayers, and beneath it all, a faint, wet sound that does not belong in a house of God. You take a step closer. The smell hits first. Sweet rot, like fruit left to die in summer heat. It cuts through the incense, clings to your clothes, seeps into your throat. People pretend not to notice. Their faces are pale, eyes lowered, as if reverence alone can mask the horror standing before them. On a raised throne draped in velvet, the king sits motionless. His crown gleams beneath the candlelight, but his skin tells a different story. What once was flesh has become parchment, split and cracked, leaking faint traces of decay. His hands, wrapped in silken bandages, rest on the armrests like relics preserved from another age. You watch him raise one trembling finger in blessing. The courtiers kneel, the choir swells, but you can see it. His ring slipping loose over skin that no longer fits the bone beneath. The king smiles faintly, though his lips are gray, his breath shallow. Every word of prayer that leaves his mouth carries the scent of death. Outside, bells toll in his honor. Inside, servants hide rags soaked in vinegar to battle the stench. Behind the altar, a physician whispers to a priest that the disease is spreading faster. And yet, the faithful call it divine suffering, a sign that the king is closer to heaven than to man. But you can see the truth behind the reverence. You can see the rot. The holy crown rests on a skull that is already surrendering. The throne of gold is beginning to stink like a tomb. Because this is not the image of glory you were taught to imagine. This is not the shining ruler of medieval tales. This is the sacred paradox of a king who ruled through faith while his body decayed in front of his people. Each breath a prayer, each step a slow unraveling of flesh and divinity. And before this night is over, you'll understand the terrible weight of that crown and how even holiness can fester. You about to hear the story of the king whose holiness couldn't stop his body from decaying while he was still alive. He was not born a monster. He was born a promise. When Baldwin first opened his eyes beneath the blazing sun of Jerusalem, the court whispered that the heavens themselves had blessed the city. The Crusaders had carved their fragile kingdom out of blood and dust, and now it had a prince, golden-haired, solemn-eyed, delicate as glass, but radiant as a mourning hymn. The people called him God's child, a living answer to their prayers. In his youth, Baldwin was everything a kingdom wanted from its heir. He spoke softly but with reason, memorized the Psalms by heart, and rode through the palace courtyards with a grace that disarmed his father's hardened knights. Even his enemies admitted that he ruled his thoughts as firmly as others ruled their armies. But glory in Jerusalem was a fragile thing. Beneath the holy banners and shining relics, the air always smelled faintly of rot, the rot of buried bodies and unfinished wars. And somewhere inside the young prince, another kind of decay was already beginning. The first sign came one morning when he was riding with his tutor. The horse stumbled, Baldwin fell. He rose laughing, brushed the dust from his arm, and froze. His hand was bleeding, but he felt nothing. No pain, no sting, only the sight of blood where there should have been warning. His tutor, thinking him dazed, pressed the wound with a cloth. Still, Baldwin smiled and said, "It doesn't hurt." That night, the old man told the royal physicians. They found nothing wrong, only a patch of skin pale as bone, cool to the touch. They whispered of humors and spirits, but their eyes betrayed fear. In this city, every mystery was either a miracle or a curse. Weeks passed. The numbness spread. Fingers lost sensation, then toes. Baldwin hit it well. He practiced his swordplay, signed decrees, attended mass. The court saw a prince maturing into command. Only his servants noticed how tightly he clenched a goblet just to keep it from slipping through his grasp. The priests called it a divine trial. They said God was testing his chosen ruler's strength of soul. They told him to pray, to fast, to accept suffering as proof of holiness. The physicians disagreed but did not dare speak openly. What they saw frightened them. A disease that stole the flesh by inches, that devoured nerves before it took life. They had no name for it, and those who tried to give it one did not keep their tongues long. Baldwin said nothing. He had watched kings die for lesser weaknesses. To rule in Jerusalem was to balance faith and fear. To show frailty was to invite the knife. He ordered his attendants to burn the bloodied cloths, to keep his gloves on even in sleep. The courtiers whispered that he had become austere, more saint than man. They did not see the dark stains beneath the linen. When his father died, the city erupted in celebration. Bells rang through the narrow streets. Priests proclaimed that a new era of light had come. The young king rode through crowds, throwing palm branches at his feet. His armor gleamed in the desert sun. No one saw that he guided the reins with only one good hand. From the palace balcony, he looked down at his people, chanting, rejoicing, believing. The scent of incense drifted up from the crowds, mingling with the salt of his own sweat. Somewhere under his robes, the numbness crept further, a slow, silent inheritance he could not escape. They called him blessed. They crowned him with gold. And no one, not the bishops, not the generals, not even the mother who kissed his hand, knew that the new king of Jerusalem was already beginning to die. Most people would turn away from such horrors, but you're still listening. Maybe that's why stories like this survive. The rest choose comfort, scroll past, and pretend history wasn't this cruel. Don't be like them. Stay with the truth a little longer. The years that followed turned the Holy Kingdom into a chamber of decay. What began as a numbness in Baldwin's fingers soon crept up his arms, to his chest, his face. At first, he disguised it with discipline. Gloves for the court, perfumes for the stench, a careful stillness to hide the tremors that betrayed him. But disease does not honor crowns. It spread like a whisper through his body, soft but relentless, stripping the king of sensation, of flesh, of sleep. One morning, while dictating a letter to the patriarch, a servant dropped a candle at his feet. Baldwin did not move. The wax splattered against his leg and burned through the cloth. He felt nothing. When they removed the boot, the skin beneath had blistered black. The doctors called it infection. The priests called it purification. Baldwin said nothing. The court physicians tried everything the age could offer. They bled him until his lips turned white, hoping to drain the evil from his veins. They smeared his limbs with honey and ashes, with crushed pearls and vinegar, with oils imported from Alexandria and relics stolen from graves. They bathed him in wine so strong the fumes made the attendants faint. The more they treated him, the faster he seemed to rot. Soon, his fingers began to crumble. The nails fell off one by one. The flesh split and peeled away, leaving pale bones that looked carved from ivory. The sores wept constantly, staining the silk sheets he lay upon. The odor was unbearable, sweet, cloying, human. No incense could hide it. Servants came in pairs so that if one fainted, the other could finish the task. Yet even as his body failed, his authority did not. He ordered decrees from his bed, his voice clear but detached, as though spoken from another world. Messengers knelt beside the mattress, soaked with bandages, to hear him whisper orders for war and peace. They avoided looking directly at him. Their eyes wandered to the ceiling, to the crucifix, anywhere but the ruin of their king. The clergy called him saintly, a ruler who suffered so that his people might prosper. They kissed his hand in ceremony, then scrubbed their lips raw in secret. Mothers brought sick children to the palace gates, begging for the king's holy touch. When Baldwin reached out, they recoiled, horrified by what faith demanded of them. The miracle they expected was a curse in disguise. Each day the sores widened. Each night the sheets had to be replaced, soaked through with what his body could no longer contain. The walls of the palace seemed to close in, trapping the stench and the prayers together until they were indistinguishable. Still, the kingdom worshipped him. Still, he ruled. But the disease was only half the story. Because Baldwin's greatest decay wasn't in his flesh. It was in what his fear did to everyone around him. The whispers began softly. Servants speaking of omens behind the kitchen doors. Nobles murmuring about the stench that clung to the royal robes. They bowed lower when he entered the hall, yet their smiles no longer reached their eyes. Each gesture of reverence became a mask to hide disgust. The priests turned their sermons towards sin. They said the king's suffering was a sign that some hidden evil lurked within his court. Some named heresy. Others blamed his counselors, his mother, his generals. Fear became doctrine. Baldwin listened, his body wrapped in linen, his face hidden behind veils. He felt the air thicken with deceit. Letters went missing. Eyes followed him too long. When he coughed, courtiers stepped back, crossing themselves. He began to doubt every voice around him, even the ones that swore loyalty on the altar. The worst betrayal came from within. One of his oldest advisors, a man he had trusted since boyhood, leaked the truth of his illness to foreign ears. The secret that Baldwin had buried beneath robes and ceremony spread like fire through the kingdom. The stories multiplied as they traveled. Some said the king was already dead and that a corpse ruled in his place. Others swore his flesh fell away at night and reformed by morning. The palace changed. Conversations stopped when doors opened. Footsteps echoed too loudly in the marble halls. Every face looked carved from fear. Ministers hid behind ritual, priests behind prayer, servants behind silence. The court became a theater of piety, each person performing devotion while trying not to breathe too deeply. The king could feel it. He could smell their lies as clearly as they smelled his decay. The throne room, once bright with banners and sunlight, became a chamber of shadows where nothing human dared to linger too long. If you're still here, you're one of the rare few who can stomach the truth. Most can't. Maybe that's why stories like this fade into dust. But if you care enough to know what really happened, prove it. Stay. Listen to what came next. The journey began at dawn. The streets of Jerusalem were lined with pilgrims clutching olive branches and relics, their eyes turned toward the palace gates where the royal litter waited. They had heard that the king was leaving for the holy sites, that he would walk, or be carried, to the places where Christ once bled, to beg for deliverance from the disease that devoured him. They called it a pilgrimage of faith. The truth was a procession of rot. Baldwin could no longer stand, much less ride. His legs had grown rigid, wrapped in layers of cloth soaked in oils to mask the odor. Beneath those wrappings, the skin had darkened and cracked like burned parchment. Each movement sent a trickle of fluid through the linen. His attendants lifted him with trembling hands and laid him on the litter, draping heavy veils across his body so the people would see only the shimmer of gold thread, not the ruin it concealed. The smell reached them anyway. Perfumed cloths hung from the poles, and servants scattered incense ahead of the procession, but the wind betrayed what ceremony tried to hide. The crowd knelt, pressing their faces into the dust, believing they were inhaling the scent of sanctity. Some swore they saw light around the veils. Others whispered that angels walked beside the litter. The priests marched beside him, chanting hymns that drowned the muffled groans of pain from within. Each time the bearers paused to rest, a cup of wine was raised to his lips, though he could no longer taste it. The sun burned high above, and beneath its heat the air shimmered with the mingled scents of myrrh, sweat, and decay. When the procession reached the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the doors were thrown open, and the bells rang as if the kingdom itself were being healed. Baldwin was carried inside and set before the altar. His courtiers knelt in rows, eyes glistening, mouths murmuring prayers that were half fear and half plea. The priests anointed him with holy oil. The congregation watched in silence as the liquid ran down the bandages and turned dark as it mixed with what seeped from beneath. By nightfall, the rumors had already begun. They said the king's color had returned, that his voice had strengthened, that a miracle was near. But behind the chamber doors, the truth unfolded quietly. The heat had blackened his limbs, the sores now deep enough to expose the bone. Each morning, the attendants peeled away the cloths and found new wounds, larger than the night before. They burned the bandages in the courtyard, and the smoke carried a sweetness that no one dared name. The pilgrimage that was meant to save him became his slow march toward dissolution. The songs of praise turned to whispers. Pity began to replace devotion. Even his enemies pitied him, a ruler trapped inside a body that betrayed every virtue he had lived by. And as the city prayed for a miracle, the king himself began to pray not for life, but for release. The weeks that followed stripped away the last illusion of strength. Baldwin returned to his throne room not as a ruler, but as a relic. They swathed him in fresh linen each morning, layer upon layer, until his form resembled a statue more than a man. His face was hidden behind a thin veil. Only his eyes remained visible, gray and distant, watching the world as though it already belonged to another realm. The throne had been modified for him, a cushioned seat lined with herbs and charcoal to absorb the fluids that leaked through the bandages. Every day, attendants carried basins filled with the cloths burned at night. The ashes drifted over the palace walls and settled on the city like gray snow. Still, he insisted on governing. Decrees were read aloud by clerks while he listened in silence, his lips moving faintly, his words too soft to be heard. The court leaned closer, straining to catch his whispers. His voice was a rasp now, the sound of air escaping through a broken reed. Even his eyes had grown cloudy, milky with the same slow rot that consumed his flesh. One morning, the council assembled as usual. The hall was silent except for the rustle of parchment. The king sat motionless, veiled and upright, while his advisors debated the latest rebellion in the north. When one of them turned to seek his approval, a sound broke the hush, a dull thud against the marble floor. They looked down. A piece of something pale had fallen from beneath the wrappings. No one spoke. The courtiers stared at the fragment lying near the dais, a piece of the king's own foot, shriveled and bloodless. An attendant stepped forward and swept it away without a word. The council resumed, their voices tighter, their eyes fixed on their scrolls. The king did not seem to notice. From that day, they said, the throne itself began to smell like a tomb. His orders came shorter, his gaze longer, as if he were listening to a voice that no one else could hear. The kingdom obeyed out of reverence, out of fear, out of habit. No one knew which. It's strange. People will binge hours of fake horror, but real history like this makes them look away. Maybe that says more about us than it does about Baldwin. If you have the stomach to face humanity's forgotten truths, remember this story. And if you turn away, ask yourself why. He died as he had lived in his final years, slowly, quietly, surrounded by the scent of sanctity and decay. The last breath left him in the still hours before dawn. No thunder, no cry, no witnesses save for two attendants who dared to remain beside the bed. They said his final exhale carried a sweetness, the same cloying fragrance that had haunted the palace for years, heavy and impossible to forget. When the physicians entered, they found him sitting upright, head bowed as if still deep in prayer. The wrappings had fused with his skin, the linen dark and stiff with the residue of years of suffering. No one spoke. The silence was thicker than the air, as though the palace itself had been holding its breath. The burial was arranged with haste. They sealed the chamber windows, ordered the bells muffled, and began to prepare the body that could no longer be touched. The priests insisted on ceremony, the physicians on speed. They wrapped him tighter still, binding the remnants of his limbs until the shape resembled a figure carved from wax. The scent of myrrh and oil could not hide the truth. The king's body was already breaking down. At the cathedral, the coffin was placed before the altar, surrounded by candles that flickered as though disturbed by unseen air. Monks chanted the psalms of the dead, their voices quivering in the echoing space. When the lid was lowered, a faint sound escaped, a sigh, or perhaps the shifting of what remained within. The people who had gathered knelt and whispered of miracles. But the miracle did not come. Within days, the scent returned, stronger than before. The marble floors grew slick beneath the coffin, a thin dark liquid seeping through the seams of the wood. The guards claimed it was holy oil, a sign that Baldwin's body was transforming into a relic. Others whispered that it was the same corruption that had followed him in life, seeking its way back into the world. The monks scrubbed the floors until their hands blistered. They prayed louder, faster, trying to drown out the odor that crept through the corridors. Some swore that at night they heard faint tapping beneath the stone, as if the coffin shifted in its grave. Others claimed to have seen footprints, bare, blackened, damp, trailing from the chapel to the cloister and vanishing by dawn. Years passed, and the legend grew. Pilgrims came to the tomb to touch the leaking stone, believing the dark stain that seeped from its cracks to be oil of sanctity. The faithful gathered it in vials, carried it across continents, swore it cured their ailments. But there were others, those who remembered the man beneath the myths. They said the liquid was not oil but the slow return of his decay, proof that the dead king still wept through the walls of his tomb. The abbots sealed the crypt more than once, each time finding the same wetness pooled at the edges of the coffin. They began to keep the chapel doors locked at night. They said it was to protect relics. Those who lived within the monastery knew better. They heard him, the faint scrape of a foot dragging across the flagstones, the sound of linen brushing against stone, the whisper of a voice reciting prayers long after the world had fallen silent. Baldwin the Blessed, they called him. Baldwin the Leper. Baldwin the Saint, who stank of death. His kingdom dissolved, but his story lingered. part miracle, part warning, always uneasy in the telling. And now, as you listen, the truth hangs between faith and fear. He was a man both holy and horrifying, a ruler who turned his own suffering into legend. In him, the sacred and the profane were bound together, inseparable as flesh and rot. Power could not save him. Faith could not cleanse him. Even the prayers of a kingdom could not silence what the body becomes when time refuses mercy. His story reminds you of a truth no scripture can comfort. Even holiness rots when it is built on denial. Was Baldwin cursed by God or by his own fear? The answer still seeps through the cracks of his tomb, dark and silent, waiting for those who dare to look closer. If you've made it this far, you're one of the rare few who truly listens. Most won't. They'll click away and forget him, just like the monks who sealed his coffin and prayed never to smell it again. But stories like this deserve to be remembered. So, if you have the courage, keep listening, keep searching, and keep the dead from being forgotten. And if you turn away, if you cannot bear it, at least admit why.